So Anush is on holiday this week, so I'm very pleased to be joined by Andrew Marr, our political editor. Andrew, I know you've been on the podcast before, but it's our first time appearing together, so welcome.
Thank you very much. It's exciting. We're in this very strange basement bar, aren't we?
We're in the Red Lion, where all the Westminster gossip happens. So nice to be recording here. This is basically our first chance to really debrief after the Spring Statement. So Andrew, I'm wondering what you make of this idea that, was this the week that Rishi Sunak's hopes of ever becoming Prime Minister were fatally dashed?
In short, yes. I've been covering budgets and spring statements and autumn statements and all of that since 1984, and I don't remember one landing quite this badly, quite this fast. They always used to say a budget which lands well on the day looks really bad a week later, and this is unique because it landed very badly on the day, and a week later and a day later and a few days later, it was still as bad.
And it's interesting. So, we can talk about how bad that reaction was as well, but I think what's interesting is that it seemed to take the Treasury and maybe even Number 10 by surprise, because the individual policies that they announced had polled quite well. It's more what was missing from it that went down so badly.
I think we should be surprised that they were surprised, because it was very, very obvious ahead of the statement the scale of the economic challenge facing the country, and particularly lower income families. You look at the galloping inflation, and inflation is not the same for everybody always. It depends where it is, and this is particularly fuel inflation, so heating inflation, car driving inflation, and food inflation, which is going to be a really big story, I think, in the weeks ahead. And that's the kind of thing that hits the poorest of families particularly hard. Now, MPs knew this, backbenchers knew this, everyone was talking about it, it was in the newspapers, and it was almost as if the Treasury had closed themselves off and gone in a tiny, clever, tight little huddle in a basement and hadn't been watching the rest of the world.
And regular listeners will remember that even a few weeks before the statement, people around Rishi Sunak were saying, look, public expectations are too high after the furlough scheme. There are global inflationary pressures. There's not very much that we can do. People are going to be disappointed. The UK economy is very exposed by these Russian sanctions, and there's very little we can do to protect people. And speaking to Labour people, they were saying they're just rolling the pitch. There's no way, given everything you were saying, given the pain that families are going to be facing in the coming months, there's no way they'll pull something out of the bag. And then actually, even though they had the odd thing, like an income tax cut right before the next election, there wasn't really anything there, just a fuel duty cut that barely
scratches the surface. Yeah, it's really interesting. I think this is partly just the way politics works. So one of the things that Rishi knew before this was that a huge number of his backbenchers and his most vociferous critics inside the Tory party, on the right of the party and on the left of the party, all hated the national insurance rise, partly because they thought it was just going to be swallowed up by the NHS and nobody would really notice it, and partly because it was yet another tax rise. And this is the highest tax in government in terms of total tax cake since the 1940s. And so he's aware that his backbenchers hate that. He's also aware that he keeps saying he's a tax-cutting and a low-tax Chancellor, and just everyone looks at what he's done and thinks, no, you're not. And so he focused on the NI problem. And he dealt with that by the threshold move, which took an awful lot of people out of that national insurance increase. And in very, very narrow terms, looking at the Tory backbenchers and what they'd been saying in specific terms to him, that might seem quite clever, except that it left 3.5 million families worse off right at the bottom of the heap. And if you look at the actual people who are going to be in real, real trouble in the next few months, it didn't help them at all. And that wasn't clever.
And on your show yesterday, you had Ian Duncan-Smith making the case that actually, as you say, it's the people on benefits who haven't benefited from this Spring Statement, and those are the people who really needed the help.
Ian Duncan-Smith's problem is that he wears a very, very distinctive brown kind of Homburg hat. And so you can spot him for a long time. So I spotted him in the street and I grabbed him and I persuaded him to come on the show. He's made a big change on Hong Kong judges. But we got him onto the economy, and it was really interesting. He was saying that actually by far the most intelligent thing to have done in this Spring Statement would have been to uprate universal credit to cover some of the or all of the inflationary rise, because that's limited to 3%, because when it's pegged originally and its inflation is going to be heading towards 8%. And he said that's the clever thing to do. We're heading towards stagflation. We're in real trouble in this economy. if you put the money into universal credit, you know virtually every pound you put in will come straight back and it'll be spent in the economy because that's what people need to do with it. And therefore you get the maximum economic uplift from that. And that was the clever thing to do. And he came quite close to sort of saying that Rishi Sunak had made a really, really serious error. He didn't use those words, but he was well aware the government will not have been listening to that interview from a former Tory leader, and they will not have liked what they heard.
It's interesting as well what you were saying, that really Rishi Sunak was focused on addressing that big problem that he has over the national insurance increase, which is so unpopular with the Tory backbenchers. But then he raised that threshold to save some people from it. And my impression, actually, right after the statement among Tory backbenchers was that they had been so focused on that a lot of them didn't see how badly the whole statement was going to land. I mean, I wasn't sure if people were just sort of spinning me or not, but, speaking to people who are often quite critical of this government and quite happy to do so, they were saying, I'm really happy with that. Fuel GD cut, great, but really that threshold increase is so important. That lifts so many people out of this tax increase. So I actually wonder, I don't know what your impression was, I wonder if Tory backbenchers were so focused on that it took a lot of them a while also to realise how badly the whole package was going to land.
I think a bit of that. Let's try really hard to be fair to Rishi Sunak. He knows there's this political problem. He tries to resolve it, and backbenchers are immediately pleased. There may be a bit of quite cynical politics here, of course, Alva, because the people at the bottom of the heap much less likely to vote Conservative, and this NI threshold change will help a lot of, as it were, middle-income families. They will not have to pay the NI increase they were going to have to pay, and maybe those are the voters that the Conservatives most want to hold in ahead of the forthcoming local elections. So there might have been a bit of sort of slightly cynical politics there as well. But I think everybody missed the big picture, and that is, as we started off by saying, that is a genuine mystery, because it's not as if the country hadn't noticed what was happening. I think people looked at what Rishi Sunak had done during the pandemic and they thought, okay, in theory, he is an orthodox Thatcherite monetarist chancellor with fairly rigid views, but he's really, really flexible. He's imaginative. He did things that nobody thought a Conservative government would do during the pandemic, and therefore, one way or another, he's going to do it again. And he absolutely didn't. He could have issued some kind of bonds to raise money and increase spending because of the crisis that we're in, and he didn't. It was a very orthodox thing. And I think the final big failure we haven't talked about was the promise of a tax cut in 2024. A modest 1p off income tax in 2024. If you're going to pull a rabbit out of a hat, as I've said before, make sure it's actually a live, twitching, warm bunny, not the promise of a bunny, a kind of hologram bunny in 2 years to come, because that satisfies nobody.
Yeah, and do you get any electoral benefit from that if you've pre-announced it?
I think minimal electoral benefit, and also that there's a simple logical problem, that you start off the Spring Statement by saying we're in very, very dark and difficult times, very unpredictable times. We have no idea what's going to happen to the economy. We don't really know what's going to happen to inflation. But, hey presto, I happen to know that in 2 years' time I'll be able to give you a tax cut. It just doesn't add up. It just doesn't make sense.
And I suppose that the speculation from some of his Tory colleagues has been that was really just to tie the hands of the government, that once you've announced that, you're a bit more committed to making spending decisions that align with that, to make sure that he actually is able to deliver it.
There may have been a little bit of him who thought, well, in 2 years' time, who's going to be Prime Minister? It might be Rishi Sunak, and therefore it's Rishi Sunak's tax cut at the crucial time. It's not Boris Johnson's tax cut. He can't have it. I'm going to leave him swinging for a bit. Relations, I think it's fair to say, between Number 10 and the Treasury are not warm.
And we talked a bit before on this podcast about Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson being locked in a kind of dance of death. But it was the other way around for a while, that Boris Johnson was the person who was doing very badly in the polls, and Rishi Sunak, there was so much speculation over whether he would move against Boris Johnson, and he fatally didn't, and then was kind of propping him up and sort of doing himself damage in the process. Now it's the other way around. Boris Johnson, I think, for all that he's full of bluster, I think there were points where he felt a little bit uncomfortable defending Rishi Sunak's announcements in the Spring Statement and wishing that he had, a different package of measures to defend.
Yes, he was in kind of wild, unchained form this week, Boris Johnson, in Prime Minister's Questions. It was not an edifying, or to my mind, particularly pleasing prospect, but he was waving his arms around and shouting. And when Keir Starmer was trying to drive a wedge between him and Rishi Sunak, he was playing that game, he immediately defended him by saying that this was the biggest tax cut for 25 years, which, if you look at the overall tax take, is simply not true.
And it's very interesting that he did. Andrew Marr liberated. It was interesting as well that the way he did that, because he was sort of, if you went and looked back, he got away with that because he was talking about the fuel duty cut. So it's the biggest tax cut to that specific tax in a very long time. But obviously the tax burden, as you were saying, at its highest in about 70 years. And, for all that, this figure that Labour have been hammering home, that for every £6 of taxes that the Chancellor is taking away, they're only giving £1 back.
And I think that figure comes from the Office of Budget Responsibility, the government's own body that it set up, the OBR. And we read this morning that Rishi Sunak really, really hates the OBR and wishes it wasn't there. And now we know why.
It's funny that this is secondary when this story was absolutely dominating months ago. We also had a development on partygate this week, didn't we? It was a bit of a damp squib in the end. About 20 officials from within Number 10 have been issued with fines. But we know that Boris Johnson wasn't one of them, and we don't know exactly who they were. When you drill into the detail, it's not great for Boris Johnson, but it hasn't been as devastating as it might have been.
Yes, we have to remember this is part one of the end game. There are almost certainly more fines to come, and they may very well include both Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak. We don't know yet. And then immediately after that, we get the full unexpurgated Sue Gray report. So there is a lot of more detail to come. And, in life, in journalism, one occasionally says the wrong thing or uses the wrong word. And I fatally described the idea that he was going to go over partygate in the middle of the war as quaint. And a lot of people have given me a serious kicking for that. I completely get it, and I understand it was the wrong word to use. But there is a sense inside the Tory party, which is what I was trying to really reflect, that they think in this situation, he's kind of invulnerable as long as the war goes on. But there's a really interesting question here is, as it were, what is the war? If the war becomes frozen into a kind of stalemate situation for months and months and months, it drifts away from the headlines a bit. And however often Boris Johnson phones President Zelensky and then releases the fact that he's phoned President Zelensky again, that kind of ceases to have the salience it has right at the moment. And so I do think that this is dangerous for him. I think I said before, maybe on the previous podcast, that I buried my father on the same day as one of those parties, and there were 6 of us standing around the grave outside a locked church. And I am still quietly boiling with anger about that. And I think up and down the country, there are a lot of people who feel the same way still. Now, the Conservative Party has taken a kind of gamble to give Boris Johnson, for the time being, a free pass. And you hear that even from people who were publicly calling for him to go before, like David Davis and Roger Gale and so on. And I wonder if they have fatally miscalculated, because if he's got a free pass for the time being, and if he gets through those May elections, which seems likely, then the party will always find another reason not to go for him. It'll be delayed and delayed and delayed, and then the general election will be hoving into sight, and he will be facing the country in a general election. And if any sense of that anger is still bubbling around the country, that may be a huge Tory miscalculation. We'll wait and see.
And now it's time for a section we like to call
You Ask Us.
I'm delighted I made Andrew do that. So today's question is about today's question is from Nick, who sent this in over Twitter. Thank you for messaging in. This is about Jamie Wallis, the Conservative MP for Bridgend, who came out as trans in a statement yesterday. A historic first trans MP. Nick has said, pretty obvious You Ask Us question, but how do you think this will, if at all, change the nature of the debate around trans issues in the UK? Andrew, what do you think?
I think that if you're in a room discussing trans issues and there is someone in the room who is trans, it changes the nature of the conversation. And I think, as it were, in the political centre in Parliament, having somebody who is trans will change the nature of the way people talk. And so it will have an immediate effect. I mean, Boris Johnson made a kind of trans joke at the beginning of his speech at the party for Tory MPs this week, on the very day, or just ahead of this announcement. And I think Jamie Wallis says that he is not trans, but he wants to be. He's still using his pronouns. But nonetheless, it was a huge moment. And I think, in a very, very good way, some of the kind of more abusive, cruel, thoughtless language around this will bleed out of the conversation as a result of this. It really is a very big moment. Interesting, going back to the 80s and the 90s, the party which had most MPs coming out as gay was the Tory party. The party which had most women in senior positions and then Prime Minister and so forth was the Tory party. And now the party with the first trans MP is the Tory party. Rather interesting for the left.
Oh, it's so interesting. And as you say, it did immediately shift the tone of this kind of thing. We saw a very respectful nod to that announcement from Boris Johnson at the beginning of Prime Minister's questions, and then again
Ian Blackford did the same, didn't he? Yeah.
And Keir Starmer. So immediate support from across the House, really. No one really saying anything critical. I think especially because Jamie Wallis talked about some quite difficult personal things in that statement. I mean, I'm someone who's really, really interested in the so-called trans debate in the UK. And I wonder how much this will really change it, just because you can see that Jamie Wallis really didn't want to be in this position. That actually the really sad thing about this statement, same as with a lot of gay MPs, in the 20th century, a lot of them, didn't really come out of their own volition, but because they were sort of under pressure from.
Yes, I think he was being blackmailed, wasn't he?
Yeah, so he didn't really do this of his own free will, and has been clearly having a very difficult time personally. So, for all that this is a sort of a great historic moment for the trans community to have the first MP who has said that they are trans, it's a sad one too. And I think that Jamie Wallis probably doesn't necessarily want to take up the mantle of being this new spokesperson for trans rights. As you say, he issued a statement about his pronouns. There were lots of questions after he said that he's trans, or I want to be was the phrase. People were saying, well, should we refer to you as she, her now, or they, them? And he's sticking with he, him. And I thought it was interesting in his statement, he said that he hadn't really intended to essentially he hadn't intended
he wanted to wait until he was over with politics. He basically retired from politics.
Yeah.
Who knows how long that would have been.
And you, I mean, I don't blame him. I mean, who would want to go through transition in the public eye when there's a really heated climate around trans rights at the moment? So it's not the sort of the big bold moment that it maybe could have been. And there was a sad part of Jamie Wallis's statement where he said, I'm not okay. And I think for all that, there would be a lot of interest if he wanted to do a lot of media on this and, talk very publicly about trans rights and that debate with a lot of authority. I just get the impression that he won't want to.
That won't happen.
Yeah.
I think the other question you raised earlier on, Ailbhe, which is really interesting, is what it does to the tone of the political debate going forward. Because before this, it seemed to be pretty clear to me that Boris Johnson, the Conservative Party, had decided to, in the loaded phrase, weaponise a lot of the woke debate, and in particular the trans debate, and that they've been looking for a long time for a way to go at Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer, in so many ways, appears so kind of conventional and straight and, family man and all the rest. It's quite difficult to find a way in to attack him, and they thought this was going to be the way to attack him, because Labour's position in this, as I understand it, is that they want to make self-ID easier, and that's where they're going. And the Conservatives had seen this as a way of kind of bringing a big chunk of Middle England back to them on this issue. And I wonder if they'll be able to do it in the same way. It's been very, very interesting how hard Keir Starmer and other senior people in the top of the Labour Party have found to answer those direct questions about what a woman is and all the rest of it. And I do think, despite this extraordinary historic moment, they're going to have to find better forms of words to stick to, or they're going to be tortured all the way to the election about it.
Yeah, well, we'll have to leave it there, but that was such an interesting conversation, Andrew.
I've really enjoyed it, Ailbhe, particularly sitting in this extraordinary kind of ancient basement in a very, very old Westminster pub where you can more or less see the bloodstains from destroyed political careers back in the 1880s, and the place where Gladstone was lamped by Disraeli. It's an extraordinary place to be having a conversation, and it's been great fun. Thanks.